There are rooms you walk into already sentenced, not by law, but by the way people look away when you enter. Amira Clark felt that before the judge ever said a word. A 16-year-old girl, no lawyer, no protection, just a folder of photocopied hope in her hands and a question the courtroom didn't want to hear. They called it vandalism. She called it a voice, one she wasn't supposed to use. And when they silenced her, not with violence but with indifference, she did something most people don't expect from a girl they've already decided to forget. She stood up, and when she spoke, the room stopped breathing. Let me take you back to the day the courthouse learned what silence sounds like when it's no longer afraid. It was barely 8:15 a.m. when the doors of the Winston County Courthouse opened, but already the air inside felt older than the hour. Dust clung to the baseboards like it had been there for generations. The floor creaked in protest as people filed in, slow and cautious, like stepping into someone else's memory. The wooden benches, lined in 2 rows down the center aisle, hadn't been reupholstered since the 80s. They held the weight of old verdicts. They smelled like varnish and silence. And silence was what Amira Clark carried with her when she walked through those doors. She didn't look like someone meant to be in a courtroom. That was the first thought that passed through the mind of the bailiff who opened the door for her. 16, thin, braids tied back with a navy ribbon that didn't match the tone of the room. Her sneakers were too clean. The kind of clean that made her look out of place on the tiled floor, like she belonged in a science lab or a debate tournament, not on trial. No one walked beside her. No lawyer, no parent. Just a girl in a thrifted wool coat, carrying a manila folder and a plastic sandwich bag that held a single sheet of paper, carefully folded. The whispers started the moment she stepped inside. "That's her?" "Yup, the girl who spray-painted the transit wall. They caught it on camera. She's gonna cry by lunch." She didn't cry, but she did tremble just once when she saw the judge's nameplate at the front of the room. Judge R.D. Whitley. Decorated veteran, county appointee for over a decade, former military prosecutor, known for being no-nonsense and efficient, which in Winston usually meant unforgiving. He didn't look up when she walked in, just shuffled a stack of papers on his desk with the same mechanical disinterest as someone flipping coupons. His glasses sat low on his nose. His fingers, thick and pink, moved with the slow confidence of someone who never needed to raise his voice to make a room obey. Amira walked toward the defense table, alone. Every step sounded louder than it should have. She kept her eyes forward, chin level, just like her father taught her when they used to practice walk-ins at the house for mock interviews. But that was back when he could still afford to believe things like preparation mattered. The judge finally looked up when she reached her seat. Just a glance. No expression. He went back to his papers. And just like that, Amira was no longer a person. She was a file, a docket number, a case to be processed. She sat down, hands folded in her lap, her fingers instinctively reaching for the edge of the plastic bag. The paper inside was old, creased, a photocopy from her father's workbench. She had read it 100 times. Hazelwood v. Kuhlmeyer, 1988. Student speech. Boundaries of expression. What schools could censor and what they couldn't. She didn't have a lawyer. Public defender's office said they were short on bandwidth. Her father couldn't come. He was working a 12-hour shift at the county diesel repair shop, fixing the same garbage trucks that drove past her mural every day without ever stopping to read it. Because no one read murals in towns like Winston. They were just color on brick. Until one of them said something no one wanted to hear. And hers had. 3 weeks ago, she had stood on an old milk crate behind the transit shelter near South Maple and Threerd. It was late afternoon. She'd brought 3 cans of paint and 1 sketch folded inside her sketchbook. The plan was precise. She'd timed it, calculated the angles, watched the security camera rotations. She hadn't meant to deface anything, at least not in the way the newspapers wrote it. What she painted wasn't vandalism, it was a face. A black face, mid-yell, mid-tear, Mid everything. It looked too much like her brother, too much like too many boys from her street. Beneath it, in simple white lettering, "Do you only hear us when we burn?" That wall had been blank for years. Now it had a voice. By morning, someone had called it anti-police propaganda. By noon, her face was on every town Facebook page with the words "troubled youth" under it. Nobody had asked why she did it. Nobody had asked what she was trying to say. They just sent a ticket. Felony vandalism. City property. Intent to incite public disorder. They used words like disorder, like she was a broken light bulb, something that needed replacing. In the courtroom, the prosecutor stood, a tall man with gray hair, a pressed blue suit, and the calm of someone who thought children were better seen and never heard. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is straightforward. The defendant, Miss Clark, knowingly defaced public property in broad daylight. She was captured on camera. The message she painted was, in our view, inflammatory, meant to agitate." Judge Whitley nodded slowly. "Is there any indication of remorse?" "She hasn't spoken a word," the prosecutor replied. "Not to the arresting officer, not during intake, not during preliminary interview." The judge turned to Amira. His first words to her, "Well, Miss Clark, nothing to say for yourself?" She lifted her eyes. She wanted to speak. She wanted to explain that her mural wasn't an act of defiance, it was a mirror. That what scared people wasn't the paint, but what it reflected. But her mouth wouldn't open. Instead, she just nodded, Onslow, steady, not in agreement, not in guilt, just acknowledgement. She saw them. They didn't see her. Behind her, someone coughed. A spectator, maybe a parent, maybe a teacher, maybe someone who just came to see what a graffiti girl looked like up close. Amira didn't turn around. She just sat, small in a chair too big, under lights too bright, in a room too white. She tried to remember her mother's voice, tried to hear the quiet hum she used to sing at night when the electricity went out. But it was gone, just like the warmth in her fingertips, just like the feeling of being 16. She wasn't 16 in that room. She was the accused. She wasn't a girl. She was a headline. In the back corner, tucked near the wall, a young man sat with a camera bag and a press badge clipped to his shirt. Elijah Monroe, 24, local paper intern. He was sent to cover a zoning meeting, but wandered into the courtroom out of curiosity. He hadn't planned to stay. But something about the way the girl sat, still and stone-faced, made him pause. She looked like his cousin. No, she looked like his sister when she got suspended for talking back to a teacher who'd mispronounced her name 3 times. Elijah began scribbling in his notebook, not quotes, just words. Small girl, big room, bigger silence. Outside, the town moved on. Garbage trucks rumbled. Lunch breaks started. Someone complained about the coffee being cold at the diner across from the courthouse. Inside, Amira waited. She didn't speak. Not because she was afraid, though she was. Not because she didn't know what to say, though she wasn't sure it would matter. She waited because her father once told her, sometimes the hardest part of telling the truth is waiting for someone to hear it. And Amira Clark had a truth. She just didn't know if this room would let her say it. Not yet. The holding room smelled like dust and lemon-scented cleaner, but mostly it just smelled tired, like a space that had witnessed more apologies than forgiveness. The walls were off-white, but not bright, just pale, like they had long since given up trying to look alive. A single metal chair sat bolted to the floor, a flickering light buzzed overhead, and somewhere in the back corner, the water fountain gurgled for no one in particular. Amira sat on the cold floor, her back pressed against the wall, not because she was told to, but because it was the only space that felt stable. The chair looked too upright, too much like a stage. And Amira had no intention of performing. She pulled the manila folder onto her lap and opened it. The same pages she had read again and again stared back smudged photocopies from her father's collection of old legal documents. The corners curled upward like they were trying to breathe. Hazelwood versus Kuhlmeyer. West Virginia v. Barnett. Tinker versus Des Moines. Each one underlined in pencil, some lines so dark from repeated tracing that they had begun to press through the paper. She didn't read them now. She just let them sit in her lap, like names of people who could have sat beside her if they'd lived in this town, in this time. But they hadn't. So now it was just her, and the silence. She thought about speaking, once, when the judge asked, but the moment had felt so tight, like the air itself was waiting to pounce if she dared to make a sound. She had practiced what to say the night before, in the mirror, with a hairbrush as a microphone, her father coaching her from the couch with tired eyes and pride he tried to mask. "You don't need to sound smart," he had told her. "You just need to sound like you mean it." But now she wasn't sure that would have been enough. Not in Winston, not in this room. Here, meaning something didn't matter if you looked like her. Here, the assumption came first. The story got filled in later. The metal door creaked open. A bailiff stepped halfway in, holding a clipboard and chewing gum. 10 more minutes, he muttered without looking at her, then closed the door again. It clicked shut with a hollow finality. Amira exhaled, her breath fogging in the cooler air of the holding room. She hadn't realized she was holding it. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the last time she had felt like a kid. Maybe it was when her mother was still alive, 6 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, legs too short to reach the floor, watching her mother stir sugar into instant coffee while humming off-key to Luther Vandross. Her mother had hands that moved fast, but eyes that didn't rush. She used to say, "Don't let anyone measure you by how quiet you are, baby. But don't shout just to be heard. Make 'em lean in." Amira didn't understand that then. But now curled up on the cold floor, the hum of courthouse machinery ticking like a warning in the ceiling, she did. No one leaned in for her. No one wanted to. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper napkin. It was empty, save for a single word scrawled in her father's handwriting. Intent. He'd handed it to her that morning at 6:40 a.m., just before she caught the bus to the courthouse. He didn't hug her, he wasn't the hugging type. But he had placed the napkin in her palm, closed her fingers around it, and whispered, "They'll try to make you forget why you did it. That's how they win. Not with the sentence, but with the shame." The shame. That's what had settled into her shoulders like a second coat. Not because she regretted the mural, but because no one asked what it meant, only what law it broke. She could feel it in the way the courtroom looked at her, as if she were already guilty of something far greater than paint, of having thoughts, of showing them. They didn't need her to cry. They needed her to comply. A soft knock tapped on the glass window in the door. She looked up. It wasn't the bailiff. It was a janitor. Older black woman, gray roots under a blue cap, pushing a mop bucket. Their eyes met for just a second. Nothing was said. No nod, no smile. Just recognition. And that was enough. Because for a moment, Amira didn't feel like a ghost in someone else's building. She felt seen. Then the woman was gone, and the silence came back harder. Amira rubbed her thumb over the word on the napkin again. Intent. It wasn't rebellion. It was remembrance. The boy in the mural wasn't just a face. He had a name. Jalen Ross. Shot in the back 2 blocks from their house. Police said he ran. Said they thought he had a gun. Said the footage was inconclusive. It never aired. No officer was charged. Jalen had once carried her books home from school because her backpack strap broke. He called her Sunshine, even though she rarely smiled. Now there was no plaque, no story, just silence. Unless she said something. Unless she painted something. Amira looked down at the papers again. Tinker, Hazelwood, Barnett. Each one a case about voices, about who got to speak, about when silence became submission. She was 16, no credentials, no platform. But she had paint and a wall. And now, this. In the hallway outside, she could hear footsteps, voices, the shuffle of something preparing itself to pass judgment. Amira folded the papers, slid them back into the manila envelope, and stood. Her knees popped, her spine cracked. Not because she was weak, but because she had been sitting in stillness for too long. She brushed off her coat, adjusted the ribbon at the end of her braid, and whispered so soft only the walls could hear. "I'm not loud, but I'm still here." And that was the part they always forgot. The hallway felt colder than the holding room. Or maybe that was just the sound of polished shoes on old tile, of bailiffs shifting radios on their hips, of a system stretching its limbs, preparing to pass sentence. Amira stood between two deputies, neither of whom acknowledged her presence beyond what was required. One walked half a step ahead, the other slightly behind. They didn't say her name, just the minor, as if that was enough. The courtroom came back into view. Same rows of stiff-backed benches, same dusty flags by the judge's bench, same low murmur of people who were curious enough to watch, but not invested enough to care. But something had shifted. Maybe it was in the way the sunlight now angled through the high windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Or maybe it was in Amira herself. She no longer walked like someone unsure whether she belonged. She walked like someone who had remembered why she showed up in the first place. When she reached the defense table, the judge wasn't looking at her. He was speaking with the prosecutor, his voice low, almost bored. Routine, predictable. She sat, unfolded her folder once again, placed it carefully on the table in front of her. The same way her father used to lay out his tools before starting work, precise, methodical, like the act itself was a kind of resistance. Judge Whitley cleared his throat and gestured for the court to reconvene. "Let's proceed," he said, adjusting the sleeves of his robe. "Mr. Langley, you may continue." The prosecutor rose, looking like he had just been interrupted from lunch, not a legal proceeding. He took 2 steps forward, clasped his hands behind his back, and began reiterating what the city had lost: trust, dignity, a sense of order, all because of a single image on a wall. Amira didn't hear most of it. She watched his shoes. Black, polished, expensive. Shoes that had never stood in line for reduced lunch. Shoes that had never stepped around chalk outlines on a sidewalk. He finished, looked back toward the judge with the confidence of a man who had never had to second-guess his tone. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "We recommend restitution and a public apology. It's not about punishment, it's about correction." Correction. Like she was a misprint. Judge Whitley turned back toward her. He didn't ask if she agreed, didn't ask if she had anything to say. He simply reached for his pen. And then, quietly, Amira stood. No announcement, no request. Just motion. A single act of standing up in a room that never expected her to move. The prosecutor's mouth flattened into a line. The gallery shifted. People leaned in, surprised, curious. Judge Whitley's eyes narrowed. "Miss Clark," he said, "you were not asked to address the court." Amira nodded slowly. "I understand, Your Honor," she said. Her voice was soft but even. "But if I'm the one being judged, I believe I have the right to be heard." There was a pause. Long enough for the tension to settle like dust across the courtroom. The judge tapped his pen once on the desk, then twice. Finally, he exhaled through his nose. 2 minutes, he said. That's all. Amira reached into her coat and pulled out the folded piece of paper. It wasn't pristine anymore. The creases were deep, the edges curled, a coffee stain kissed one corner. But it held something more powerful than any exhibit in that room. She stepped forward, turned, faced the bench, and read. In the case of Tinker v. Des Moines Independent Community School District, the United States Supreme Court ruled that students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. The room hushed. Even the court reporter paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. Amira continued, her voice stronger now. If that right exists inside a school, then surely it cannot vanish on the sidewalk of a public street or the wall of a city-owned shelter. She looked up from the page, right into the judge's eyes. What I painted was not graffiti. It was a question. a question no one wanted to answer. And if this court punishes me for it, then we are not debating vandalism. We are debating whether a black teenager has the right to ask a question out loud. The gallery held its breath. Judge Whitley leaned back, but said nothing. Amira folded the paper again, slid it back into her coat, and just before stepping back, she added, "I didn't come here to argue. I came to remind the court that truth doesn't need permission to exist." She sat down, and the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent. In the back row, Elijah Monroe felt his pen fall out of his hand. He hadn't meant to drop it. He wasn't even writing, just gripping it. Hard. What she had just done, it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't ask for pity or applause. It just was. Like water. Like truth. He stared at her. This girl who looked like his sister. Like his friend back in college who dropped out after being profiled at a gas station. Like every voice he'd ever heard and ignored because the volume was low. And he realized he wasn't watching a trial. He was watching a moment. One of those rare, aching moments when something impossible cracks open and light gets in. Judge Whitley didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then, clearing his throat again, he simply said, "Court will recess for 1 hour. I will deliver a ruling after the break." He didn't look at Amira. Not once. But something in his voice was altered, loosened, like the air around him had thickened with something he hadn't expected to feel. The bailiff banged the gavel once. The room stirred to life. But Amira didn't move. She remained seated, calm, breathing through her nose, one hand resting lightly on the manila folder. She had said what needed to be said. Now it was their turn to decide what to do with it. As people exited the courtroom, the air was different. No one chuckled. No one muttered "graffiti girl" under their breath. People glanced over their shoulders. Some with confusion, others with something close to awe. One woman, maybe a teacher, maybe just a mother, whispered to her friend, "She's smarter than the whole damn room." Back in the hallway, Elijah opened his phone and tapped out a headline without thinking. "Black teen invokes Supreme Court in defense of mural leaves courtroom stunned." He hit save. Not publish. Not yet. Because something was still happening. Something wasn't finished. And for once, he wanted to stay until the very end. Judge Whitley had sat in that chair for 17 years. Same bench. Same height. Same soft creak when he leaned forward too far. But that afternoon, when he walked back into the courtroom after recess, something about the chair felt unfamiliar, too upright, too exposed, like it no longer belonged to him the way it once had. The room was waiting, not just for a verdict, but for something else, something unspoken but very present, the kind of waiting that doesn't make sound, only tension. Whitley adjusted his robe with careful fingers, his usual habit, before a ruling. Then he looked up. Amira was already standing. Not in protest. Not in defiance. Just standing the way someone might stand when they're ready to look the world in the eye. The judge cleared his throat. "Miss Clark," he began, "before I issue the court's decision, I'd like to offer you the chance to make a final statement if you still wish to speak." It wasn't a gesture of mercy. It wasn't generosity. It was something closer to necessity. A man trying to recover something he wasn't sure he'd ever had to begin with. Moral clarity. Amira stepped forward, steady. She didn't have notes. She didn't pull anything from her coat. She just looked up at the judge, this man who had first looked at her like a child playing dress-up in an adult's room, and said, "You asked me earlier what I believe I'm fighting for." She paused, her voice as still as water. "I thought about that. A lot. And I realized I'm not fighting." The room shifted. Someone leaned forward. Amira continued, "I'm not fighting because I'm not trying to win against you or this courtroom or anyone in here. Fighting assumes there's a war, and I didn't bring a weapon." Her hands remained at her sides. "My father taught me that some rooms will never be yours, but you walk into them anyway. Not to prove you belong, but to remind them what belonging should look like. Then she looked directly at Judge Whitley. Her voice softened, but somehow became more precise. I didn't come here to challenge your authority. I came here to see if it remembers what it's for. A beat of silence. Not dramatic, just honest. Like a mirror being held up in a room where no one wanted to look. Judge Whitley blinked, once, but Amira wasn't done. And if it doesn't, she added, then maybe the problem isn't who walks into this courtroom, but who gets to sit behind the bench and forget who they used to be before they sat there. No anger, no venom, just a sentence so exact it left no air between the words. The judge opened his mouth slightly, but nothing came. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked still, like something inside him had been pinned open. Amira nodded once, not as a bow, but like punctuation, a full stop at the end of a truth too sharp to touch. Then she stepped back to the table and sat down. No one clapped. No one cheered. That wasn't the kind of silence this was. This was a silence that taught, that settled, that carved. Elijah Monroe, in the back row, exhaled slowly. His fingers hovered over his phone screen. He didn't write anything this time. He just listened. Because some stories weren't meant to be typed in real time. Some needed space to breathe. Judge Whitley looked down at his hands. One of them was gripping the edge of the bench a little too tightly. He had spent his career avoiding moments like this. Moments where the robe didn't shield him, where the gavel didn't give him the final word. Moments where truth walked in wearing sneakers and quiet resolve. He looked back up at her. A 16-year-old girl. No legal counsel. No name that carried weight. No media training. Just a worn folder, a voice she refused to silence, and a father who taught her what the law was supposed to mean. And she hadn't humiliated him. She had exposed something far more dangerous. His forgetting. He leaned forward. Hands clasped. Voice low. Miss Clark. He paused. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because, for once, he didn't want to say it wrong. You've reminded this courtroom that justice is not a possession. It's a practice. And I've been practicing wrong. Gasps? No. Just breath. Inhaled. Held. He turned toward the court reporter, then to the clerk. This court will reconvene tomorrow morning for final ruling. Further reflection is required. And then he did something no one expected. He stood. He didn't have to. The bench was his. The robe was his. But at that moment, standing was the only way he could look Amira Clark in the eye and mean it. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. She just met his gaze. Two people, one system between them. And for the first time, maybe, just maybe, both of them were awake inside it. That night, Elijah published his article. He didn't use the word graffiti. He didn't use the word teen. The headline read, "Young woman holds court accountable without raising her voice." And beneath it, just one quote. The line that stayed with everyone long after the lights in the courthouse went dark. I didn't come here to challenge your authority. I came here to see if it remembers what it's for. 7 months later, on the corner of South Maple and Threerd, the wall still stood. Unpainted, untouched, unapologetically present. The city had debated removing it. There had been meetings, letters, a petition or two, but in the end, no one moved. Not because they agreed, but because they didn't know how to paint over a voice that wouldn't go quiet. So it stayed. The mural of the boy with his mouth open, his eyes wide, and beneath him the words, "Do you only hear us when we burn?" And now, beside that wall, stood a door. No sign, no neon lights. Just a modest bronze plaque above the frame. The listening room, founded by Amira Clark. Inside, the space was soft. Warm wood floors, old couches mismatched on purpose. A round table in the center, always with notebooks and pens. Some called it a youth space. Others called it a community forum. But no one called it unnecessary. Because every Thursday, that room filled with students, Teachers, janitors, pastors, former parolees, first-time voters, people who wanted to speak or hear or just sit in a room where silence wasn't a sentence, but a starting point. And Amira was there every week. Not as a leader, not as a symbol, just as someone who remembered what it felt like to be unheard and decided to never let another voice vanish that way again. That night, a small local station came to film a segment on the listening room human interest piece, Sunday filler. The young reporter, Riley Torres, was new, polite, nervous, but sharp in the eyes. She moved quietly through the room, taking notes, catching glances, listening first. She didn't ask about the trial. She didn't need to. Everyone in Winston knew the story by now. The verdict had gone in Amira's favor. The ruling cited Tinker and contextual public speech. The charges were dropped, but it wasn't the dismissal that changed the air. It was the apology, on record. Judge Whitley's voice steady but cracked when he said, "I ruled from habit, not from heart." Miss Clark reminded me what justice sounds like. The segment was almost over. Riley had her footage, her interviews, but something held her back. As the chairs were being stacked and lights dimmed, she found Amira by the window, sipping tea, watching dusk settle over the mural like it was tucking it in. "Amira," Riley said, stepping closer. "One last question, if that's okay." Amira turned. "Sure." Riley hesitated, then asked not as a reporter, but as a human being trying to understand. "If you could say one thing, just one, to the judge from that day, what would it be?" The room behind them quieted. Amira didn't blink. She didn't look away. She just placed the mug on the sill, folded her hands, and answered. "I'd ask him if he's ever wondered what kind of person he becomes when no one in the room can tell him no." Silence. Not accusatory. Not bitter. Just still. Riley didn't write it down. She didn't need to. Some answers don't live on paper. They live in the way a person has to breathe through them. Outside, cars passed by slowly. A group of kids sat on the steps of the listening room, passing markers, sketching drafts for a new mural panel, one that would honor local lives lost to systems too slow to say their names. Amira stepped outside, nodded to them. They smiled. One girl, maybe 12, held up her sketch, a mouth drawn open like a blooming flower, the petals shaped like words. Underneath, she had written, "They listened because you didn't yell." Amira looked at it, then looked at her, and said nothing. Just reached out and squeezed the girl's hand. Across town, in the private study of a modest brick home, Judge Whitley sat alone. He no longer drove to work, took medical leave a month after the ruling. Burnout, the paper said. But those who had worked beside him knew better. Something had shifted. He no longer barked orders. He didn't interrupt staff meetings, and every time someone asked what changed, he only answered with 5 words. "She made me stay awake." On his desk now sat a copy of the Constitution, the same edition he had received in law school. Pages yellowed, corners frayed. He opened it every morning, not to memorize, but to remember. That Sunday, the news segment aired. Not national, not viral, just small-town, local coverage. But still, it spread. Clips shared, excerpts reposted, quotes turned into graphics. And in classrooms, barbershops, book clubs, dorm rooms, something subtle began to shift. Not a movement, not yet, but a pause before assumptions, before rulings, before silence. A pause long enough to hear. And so, when people ask what the listening room really is, whether it's a nonprofit or a youth center or just a story someone turned into a building, those who've been inside know better. It's not a room. It's a reminder. That truth doesn't need volume to matter. That silence can be sacred, but never permanent. That justice, when it forgets to listen, becomes something else entirely. And above all, that sometimes the most powerful sentence spoken is the one that reflects back on the listener. Have you ever sat in a room where your voice didn't matter? Where no one looked at you long enough to ask why you were really there? They just assumed you belonged in the margins. Amira Clark's story isn't just about a courtroom. It's about the quiet places where dignity learns to survive, even when no one is listening. And maybe you've been in a place like that too. If you have, or if you know someone who has, let this story be a reminder. Your worth is not measured by the volume of your voice, but by the truth it carries. And even when the world refuses to hear you, your silence can still speak with power if you hold it with purpose. So take heart, hold your ground, and remember, the moment you feel invisible might be the moment you're becoming unforgettable. If this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and let us know in the comments, have you ever felt like Amira? What gave you the strength to stay standing? Because as Amira reminded us all, I didn't come here to challenge your authority. I came here to see if it remembers what it's for. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story. Stay tuned.